Part 1. The first encounter expanded script. I had just moved into the building a few weeks earlier, still getting used to the rhythm of the place. The hum of the elevator, the faint smell of detergent that lingered in the hallways, the muffled laughter of families behind closed doors. It was ordinary, really, until the evening I met her. I was juggling more grocery bags than I should have been carrying, trying to hook the strap of one around my wrist while fishing for my keys with the other hand. Of course, one of the bags slipped. Apples rolled out across the floor, bouncing against the wall with a dull thud. That's when I heard her voice. "Careful there," she said, low and steady, with the faintest note of amusement. I looked up, and there she was, my neighbor. She must have just stepped out of her apartment. Mid-40s, graceful in the kind of way that doesn't demand attention but holds it anyway. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the glow of the hallway light. She bent down effortlessly, scooping up an apple that had rolled near her feet. "You're blushing already? How sweet." I froze for half a second, the words slipping from her lips so casually, as if teasing me was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Heat crept up my neck as I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out a little unsteady. "Guess I'm not great at first impressions." She smiled then, not the kind of smile you give out of politeness, but something warmer, softer, with a trace of mischief in it. She handed me the apple, her fingers brushing mine. The touch was nothing more than accidental, yet it seemed to linger far longer than it should. "You'll be fine," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You're the new one, right? Apartment 302. I nodded. She remembered. Somehow that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. "I'm across the hall," she continued. "If you ever need help, preferably not with carrying groceries, though." The laugh that followed was gentle, melodic, the kind of sound that fills a quiet corridor with warmth. I managed a smile, awkward but genuine. "Noted." She gave a small wave before unlocking her door, slipping inside with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere she went. And just like that, the hallway was empty again. But for some reason, I stood there a moment longer, holding onto the grocery bag as if her touch were still imprinted on my skin. My heart hadn't raced like that in a long time, not over a simple smile, not over such a brief encounter. That was the night I realized something. This woman, my neighbor, wasn't just someone I'd pass by occasionally in the hall. She was going to matter, and whether I was ready for it or not, she had already noticed me. Part 2, small conversations, growing curiosity, expanded script. After that first meeting, I found myself noticing her more often. Maybe she had always been there, moving gracefully through the building's quiet routines, but now she stood out to me, like a song I hadn't paid attention to before, suddenly stuck in my head. It started with little moments. At the mailbox downstairs, I'd find her already flipping through envelopes, one eyebrow arched as if bills were personally mocking her. She'd glance up, catch me watching, and smirk as if she had caught me. "Nothing exciting today," she'd say, holding up a stack of letters. "Unless you count the electricity bill." I laughed, a little too quickly probably. Well, that's one way to keep things grounded. Her lips curved, half amused, half thoughtful. She had this way of looking at me, like she was both entertained and slightly curious, as if I were some puzzle she hadn't decided whether or not to solve. Then there were the hallway encounters. I'd come home from a late shift, exhausted, only to see her unlocking her door. Sometimes she looked sharp and put together, like she'd just stepped out of an important meeting. Other times, she carried her tiredness openly, shoulders lowered, a sigh slipping out before she even noticed I was there. The first time I caught her like that, she tried to cover it up with a quick smile. But I had already seen it, that quiet vulnerability beneath the confident exterior. And something about it made her feel even more human. We talked in small doses. She asked about my work, my studies, the kind of casual, neighborly questions that could have easily stayed surface level. But with her, Even those small questions felt heavier, more intentional. "What do you do with your days?" she asked once, her tone curious, not dismissive. I told her about my job. Nothing glamorous, just something steady to get by. She listened as if it mattered. Really listened. And I found myself wanting to say more, to keep her attention just a little longer. One evening, I ran into her just as she was heading back from the grocery store. A simple cardigan draped over her shoulders, a bag tucked against her hip. She looked ordinary, and yet I couldn't stop noticing the details. The way her hair had loosened from its clip, the faint smell of vanilla that followed her as she passed. "Good timing," she said lightly, shifting the bag. "You're taller than me. Want to be a gentleman and put this on the top shelf for me?" I laughed, nodding, taking the bag from her hands. Our fingers brushed again, brief but sparking something just beneath my skin. By the time I slid her groceries onto the shelf, she was smiling at me in that knowing way of hers. Not overly friendly, not overly distant, just enough to make me wonder what she saw in me. When she finally slipped into her apartment, the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the hall long after the door closed. I stood there for a moment longer, holding on to the weight of our small talk, realizing these tiny exchanges were becoming the brightest parts of my day. She was my neighbor, yes, but already she was starting to feel like something more. Part 3, an invitation inside, expanded script. The rain had caught me off guard that evening. I hadn't even brought an umbrella, just a thin jacket that was no match for the sudden downpour. By the time I reached our floor, my hair was dripping and my clothes clung uncomfortably to my skin. All I wanted was to get inside, dry off, and forget the miserable weather. But she was there, standing by her door, fumbling with her keys while balancing a paper bag tucked against her side. She looked up just as I came out of the elevator, her eyes flicking over my soaked state. "Oh dear," she said softly, with that familiar mix of concern and teasing. "You look like a stray cat left out in the storm." I tried to laugh it off, though my teeth were almost chattering. "Yeah, well, I guess I wasn't prepared." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. Then, almost as if it was the most natural thing in the world, she opened her door wider. "Come in. You'll catch a cold standing around like that." I hesitated. It felt different stepping across her threshold, even if it was just to dry off. But the warmth spilling from her apartment was too inviting, and before I could think of a reason to decline, I found myself inside. Her place was cozy in a way that felt lived in. Soft lamplight glowed across the room. A small stack of books rested on the coffee table, one left open as if she'd been halfway through it. A knitting project lay draped over the arm of a chair, the needles still tucked neatly in place. It wasn't staged for anyone's eyes but her own, and somehow that made it all the more beautiful. She disappeared for a moment, returning with a towel in her hands. "Here," she said, her tone both practical and gentle. She handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine just briefly, enough to send a subtle warmth through me that had nothing to do with the towel itself. I muttered a thank you, dabbing at my hair, then my jacket. She gave a small laugh. "You're making it worse. Sit, I'll put some coffee on. That should help." I sank into the couch, the cushions soft and welcoming. From the kitchen, I could hear the faint clink of cups, the whistle of the kettle. The rain outside tapped steadily against the windows, a rhythm that filled the silence between us. When she returned, she carried 2 steaming mugs, setting one gently in front of me before taking her own seat. Closer than I expected. Her knee brushed mine lightly as she settled in, and though it might have been accidental, she didn't move away. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers. She glanced at me, her smile soft. "Better." I nodded, but inside, I knew she wasn't just asking about the rain. That evening, in the quiet glow of her living room, something shifted. The distance between us felt smaller, the air heavier, Not in a way that suffocated, but in a way that pulled. And though I told myself it was just coffee, just neighborly kindness, a part of me already knew better. Part 4. Sharing vulnerabilities, expanded script. The steam curled from our mugs as the rain softened outside, a quiet backdrop that made the living room feel even more insulated, almost suspended in its own little world. She leaned back into the couch, cradling her cup with both hands, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked unguarded. It wasn't that her confidence was gone. That part of her was steady, ingrained, but in the hush of her apartment, something softer slipped through. She exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window where drops still slid lazily down the glass. "You know," she began, her voice low, "I used to love storms. The sound, the way everything slows down. But lately, they could just make me feel restless." "Ich glänzte her, Quietest." She caught my look, then gave a small laugh, shaking her head as if to wave it off. But instead of changing the subject, she went on. "I've been on my own for a while now," she said. "Divorce does that. People think it's just paperwork, but it leaves a silence you don't really prepare for. And some days," she trailed off, her lips pressing together as if she'd said too much. I felt a weight in my chest, not of pity, but of recognition. Loneliness. I knew that ache, though in a different shape. I wanted to say something that would matter, but the words felt clumsy on my tongue. So I just said the truth. "I get it. Not the divorce part," I added quickly, "but the silence. Coming home to nothing but your own voice. Sometimes it feels heavier than the workday itself." She turned her head then, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pity, not dismissal, something closer to understanding. "You're young," she said softly, though there was no condescension in it. "You should be out there, chasing things surrounded by people, not sitting in a neighbor's apartment, listening to someone complain about loneliness." "Maybe," I admitted, a faint smile tugging at my mouth. "But honestly, I don't mind being here. Not at all." Her eyes softened. For a moment, the silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that says more than words. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she set her cup down and reached across the small space between us. Her hand rested lightly on my forearm, her touch warm against the cool fabric of my sleeve. It wasn't bold or intentional, more like an instinct, a gesture of quiet thanks. The contact sent a subtle jolt through me, not sharp, but steady, like a current humming beneath the skin. I didn't move. I didn't want to. "Thank you," she murmured, her thumb brushing once against my arm before she pulled back. "For listening, for not making it feel foolish." I swallowed, my chest tightening, and offered the only thing I could. "It's not foolish. It's honest. And I like that." Her lips curved faintly, almost shyly this time. And just like that, the storm outside didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a rhythm we both understood, steady, lingering, pulling us quietly closer. The days that followed seemed to fall into a rhythm. It wasn't planned, we didn't set appointments or carve out schedules, but somehow we kept finding each other. A knock on my door when she made too much dinner and didn't want leftovers. A text to borrow sugar, though I suspected she had plenty. Passing comments in the hallway that turned into hour-long talks leaning against her doorway. Her apartment became familiar, not in a careless way, but in a way that carried its own quiet thrill. I knew the sound of her kettle when it boiled, the way the light from her balcony spilled a golden glow into the living room, the faint lavender scent that clung to her throw pillows. One evening, she asked if I'd stay for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and a bottle of wine she'd opened but didn't want to finish alone. We sat across from each other, and though the food was simple, it felt intimate. Her laughter filled the small space, weaving into the clink of silverware and the hum of music from her speakers. Later, we stood side by side in her living room, adjusting a crooked picture frame on the wall. It should have been nothing, a mundane task, but as I stretched up to straighten it, she moved closer to guide the angle. Her hand brushed against mine on the frame. Her shoulder pressed softly against my arm. When I turned my head, she was already looking at me. It was the kind of closeness that shifted the air, just inches between us, her breath faint against my cheek, her eyes steady and searching. For one suspended moment, the world seemed to narrow down to that space. Her, me, and the question hanging silently between us. I felt my pulse hammering in my chest. My instinct screamed to lean in, to close that impossible distance. But she hesitated, and so did I. A tiny flicker of fear, of overstepping, of breaking whatever fragile thing was forming between us, held me in place. Her lips parted, as if she might say something. But then she smiled instead, small and wry, as though she'd caught herself drifting too close to the edge. She took a step back, tilting her head at the picture frame, as though nothing had happened. "Better," she said lightly, her voice steadier than her eyes. I swallowed hard, forcing a nod. "Yeah, looks good." The moment had passed, but its shadow lingered, buzzing beneath my skin, filling every quiet second afterward with a restless energy. We spent the rest of the evening talking, sitting across from each other as though distance was safer. Yet even then, our gazes kept catching, holding just a beat too long. Her laugh softened when it was just for me, and every time her hand brushed mine as she reached for something, I felt it, that unspoken pull, magnetic and undeniable. By the time I finally left, the night air felt cooler than it should have. But inside I was burning, and though nothing had been said, nothing had been done, I knew we were both aware of it. We were no longer just neighbors. Not anymore. It happened on one of those evenings that felt almost ordinary. She had asked me to stop by to help fix a lamp in her living room. Nothing dramatic, just a small request, the kind neighbors make when they know someone is willing to lend a hand. The lamp had been flickering, the bulb stubbornly refusing to stay lit. I crouched beside it, fiddling with the socket while she watched from the couch. She offered occasional commentary, half teasing, half amused, sipping a glass of wine as though she were supervising some elaborate operation. "You know," she said with a faint smile, "you'd make a decent handyman. Maybe that should have been your career." I laughed, glancing up at her. "Yeah? Then you'd be calling me over every day just to tighten a screw or change a light bulb." "Maybe I would," she replied, her tone soft but deliberate. For a second, I forgot about the lamp altogether. When I finally managed to get the light steady, I leaned back with a quiet sense of triumph. But as I reached to gather my things, the edge of the metal caught my finger. A small sting, then a thin line of red. "Damn," I muttered under my breath. Before I could wave it off, she was already beside me, moving faster than I expected. "Let me see." Her voice was low, firm but gentle. I tried to protest, but she took my hand anyway, cradling it in both of hers as if it were something fragile. She dabbed at the cut with a tissue, her brow slightly furrowed in concentration. The warmth of her fingers against mine sent a hum through me stronger than the sting itself. "It's nothing," I said, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. She looked up then, her eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt impossibly still, as if even the ticking clock on the wall had paused. Her lips curved, not in mischief this time, not in teasing, but in something quieter, something tender. "You really are too sweet," she whispered. And before I could respond, she lifted my hand slightly and pressed her lips to my knuckle. A kiss so soft, so fleeting, I might have doubted it happened at all, if not for the way it set fire to every nerve in my body. I froze, caught between disbelief and the ache of wanting more. My breath caught in my throat. She let my hand linger in hers for just a heartbeat longer before gently setting it down. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was charged, alive, filled with something we could no longer pretend wasn't there. Neither of us said the words. We didn't need to. That single kiss, light as it was, had crossed the line for us. We weren't just neighbors. We weren't just friends. And though nothing else happened that night, I knew we had stepped into something neither of us could or wanted to walk back from. The days after that evening carried a new weight. Not heavy in a burdensome way, but in the way a promise feels when it rests quietly in your chest. We hadn't spoken about what happened, about the soft kiss she'd left on my hand, about the silence that followed. But it lived between us, unspoken yet undeniable. One night, she asked if I wanted to sit on her balcony. The storm had passed days ago, and the sky was clear now, painted in shades of indigo and fading gold. A soft breeze slipped through, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a plant she kept in the corner. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders as we stepped outside, then unfolded it slightly, draping the other half across me without a word. The gesture was simple, casual almost, but it pulled me closer until the line of her arm brushed gently against mine. We didn't talk much at first. The city hummed below us, distant car horns, the occasional bark of a dog, the rhythm of life carrying on beneath our quiet perch. She sipped from a glass of wine, and I nursed a cup of tea she'd made for me. Our silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like we'd already said everything worth saying. At one point, she leaned her head against my shoulder. It was such a small shift, yet it sent a warmth rushing through me. I glanced down at her, at the way her eyes softened as she stared out at the skyline. She looked peaceful in that moment, and maybe, just maybe a little content. I didn't think I'd want this again, she said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost carried away by the breeze. Want what? I asked gently. She hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass. Connection. Closeness. After the divorce, I told myself I was fine, that I didn't need anyone. But then she trailed off, her head tilting the faintest bit against me. You made me remember what it feels like to be seen. Her words tightened something deep inside me. I turned my hand over, letting my fingers brush against hers where they rested on her lap. She didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined her hand with mine, slowly, deliberately, as though the decision carried weight. The warmth of her palm against mine was steady, grounding. I held it carefully, afraid to squeeze too tightly, as if I might break the fragile honesty of the moment. For a long while, we just sat like that. No declarations, no dramatic promises. Just two people sharing silence, bound together by something quiet but unmistakable. As the night deepened, she shifted slightly, her cheek brushing my shoulder. The gesture was tender, unspoken, and enough. And in that stillness, I realized I didn't need anything more. Not grand confessions, not certainty about the future. Just this, her hand in mine, her head against my shoulder, the cool air wrapping around us like a secret we'd chosen to keep. For once, I wasn't just the boy next door. I was hers, and she was mine, in the simplest, quietest way.